One February afternoon in the year 1822, about 2 o'clock, for this is the hour at which his day begins, the most notorious personality of his century arouses himself, in the Palazzo Lanfranchi in Pisa. George Gordon Noel, Lord Byron, languidly arises and dresses, with the assistance of his devoted valet, Fletcher. Invariably, he awakens in very low spirits, in actual despair and despondency, he has termed it. This is in part constitutional, and partly, no doubt, a reaction after the feverish brain work of the previous night. It is, at any rate, in unutterable melancholy and ennui that he surveys in the mirror that slight and graceful form which had been idolized by London drawing-rooms, and the pale, scornful, beautiful face, like a spirit, good or evil, which the enthusiastic Walter Scott has termed a thing to dream of. He notes the grey streaks already visible among the brown locks, and mutters his own lines miserably to himself. Through life's dull road, so dim and dirty, I have dragged to 33. What have these years left to me? Nothing, except 33. An innumerable motley crowd of reminiscences, most of them bitter, sorrowful, or contemptuous, throng across his mind, shaping themselves into poignant verse. There's not a joy the world can give like that it takes away, when glow of earthly thought declines in feeling's dull decay. 'Tis not on youth's smooth cheek that blush alone, which fades so fast, but the tender bloom of heart is gone, ere youth itself be past. Oh, could I feel as I have felt, or be what I have been, or weep as I could have wept o'er many a vanished scene, as springs in desert found seem sweet, all brackish though they be, so midst the withered waste of life those tears would flow to me. A meagre breakfast, of claret and soda, with a few mouthfuls of some Italian dish, somewhat restores his natural vivacity, and he listens with cynical amusement to Fletcher's blood-curdling stories of phantoms who have made the night hideous. For the famous old feudal palazzo, with its dungeons and secret chambers, has been immemorially infested with ghosts and harassed by inexplicable noises. Fletcher has already begged leave to change his room, and then refused to occupy his new room because, as his master reports, there are more ghosts in there than the other. There is one place where people were evidently walled up. I am bothered about these spectres, as they say the last occupants were too. However, he is laughing as he descends the magnificent staircase, the reputed work of Michelangelo, laughing until the shrill, querulous cries of peevish children make him stop and frown. He has allowed the Leigh Hunts, with their large and fractious family, to occupy for the present the ground floor of the palazzo, and the children are his pet abhorrence. I abominate the sight of them so much, he has already told Moore, that I have always had the greatest respect for the character of Herod. No child figures in any of his poems. His own paternal feeling towards Ada, sole daughter of my house and home, is merely a fluctuating sentiment. He shrugs his shoulders and enters his great salon, again moody and with a downcast air, and throws himself upon a couch in gloomy reverie. Snatches of poetry wander through his thoughts, poetry intrinsically autobiographical, for the inequalities of his style are those of his career, and his imaginary heroes are endless reproductions of himself, the wandering outlaw of his own dark mind. He has drawn his own picture more effectively in Laura than any strange hand could do. In him, inexplicably mixed, appeared much to be loved and hated, sought and feared, opinion, varying o'er his hidden lot, in praise or railing, ne'er his name forgot. There was in him a vital scorn of all, as if the worst had fallen which could befall. He stood a stranger in this breathing world, an erring spirit from another hurled. His early dreams of good outstripped the truth, and troubled manhood followed baffled youth. His men, in short, as has been observed, are made after his own image, and his women after his own heart. Yet the inveterate family likeness of these heroes is not shown by the heroines of his romantic stanzas, for Byron has an eclectic taste in beauty. One can hardly imagine a wider dissimilarity than between the Bride of Abydos, the gentle Zuleika, with her nameless charms unmarked by her alone, the light of love, the purity of grace, the mind, the music breathing from her face, the heart whose softness harmonized the whole, and oh, that eye was in itself a soul, and Circassia's daughter, the stately Layla of the Giaour, whose black and flowing hair swept the marble where her feet gleamed whiter than the mountain sleet. Or, if the reader seek a further choice, there is Medora, beloved of the Corsair, Medora of the deep blue eye and long fair hair, or the nameless Eastern maiden of the Hebrew melodies. She walks in beauty, like the night, of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes. Thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace which waves in every raven tress, or softly lightens o'er her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express how pure, how dear their dwelling place. And on that cheek, and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent, the smiles that win, the tints that glow, but tell of days in goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocence. Yet all these heroines are alike in one respect, the potentiality of passionate emotion, since Byron's passions and his powers, according to his intense admirer Shelley, are incomparably greater than those of other men, and he has used the last almost recklessly in portrayal of the first. As the poet reclines in sombre meditation, his reverie is broken by the not unwelcome entrance of his friends, who may be better termed his intimate acquaintances. For to that brooding, introspective spirit, constitutionally shy, and morbidly conscious of the fact, friendship is a propensity, he has declared, to which my genius is very limited. I do not know the male human being, except Lord Clare, the friend of my infancy, for whom I feel anything that deserves the name. All my others are men of the world friendships. Be that as it may, it is with a warmly cordial expression, and with that peculiarly sweet smile of his, that Byron welcomes his usual visitors, Captain Williams, Captain Medwin, Taff, the Irishman, and Percy Bysshe Shelley, the most companionable person under 30, he has avowed, that ever I knew. When they have discussed the latest little paysanne on dit, and the progress of Shelley's boat building, the conversation trends more and more toward literary topics, personal topics, be it understood, for Byron is not an omnivorous reader like Shelley. Williams and Medwin, themselves dabblers in verse and prose, listen with respectful admiration to the dicta of the great poet's exchanging views. The low, clear, harmonious voice of Byron is a sort of intoxication. Men are held by it as under a spell. He makes no secret of his open contempt for the professional writing fraternity. Who will write if he has anything better to do? He scornfully inquires. I think the mighty stir about scribbling and scribes by themselves and others a sign of effeminacy, degeneracy, and weakness. Shelley, whose assiduous studies in literature have led him quite to other conclusions, defends his craft with ardour, but Byron's chief successes have been too lightly won. He who wrote The Corsair in 10 days, The Bride of Abydos in 4, and Laura, whilst undressing after balls and masquerades, cannot be expected to take a very serious view of poetry as the one business of a lifetime. I by no means rank poetry or poets, says he, high in the scale of imagination. Poetry is the lava of the imagination, whose eruption prevents an earthquake. If I live 10 years longer, he adds prophetically, you will see that all is not over with me. I don't mean in literature, for that is nothing, and it may seem odd enough to say, I don't think it's my vocation. But you will see that I shall do something or other. This contemner of poesy, however, is soon persuaded, without much difficulty, to read aloud some excerpts from his new poems in the process of completion, and very well he reads them. The listeners are moved to smiles by the bitter humour of The Visitation of Judgment. They are left half breathless by the impetuous vigour of Heaven and Earth, but a murmur of unfeigned applause punctuates the second canto of Don Juan, with its exquisite presentment of youth, love, and ecstasy in the persons of Juan and Haidée. It was the cooling hour, just when the rounded red sun sinks down behind the azure hill, which then seems as if the whole earth bounded it, circling all nature, hushed and dim and still, with the far mountain crescent half surrounded, on one side, and the deep sea, calm and chill, upon the other, and the rosy sky, with one star sparkling through it like an eye. And thus they wandered forth, and hand in hand, over the shining pebbles and the shells, glided along the smooth and hardened sand. They looked up to the sky, whose floating glow spread like a rosy ocean, vast and bright. They gazed upon the glittering sea below, whence the broad moon rose circling into sight. They heard the waves splash, and the wind so low, and saw each other's dark eyes darting light into each other, and beholding this, their lips drew near, and clung into a kiss. Don Juan. Byron's restless spirit, perpetually eager to express itself in action, now makes him anxious to dismiss intellectual discussions, and he hastily proposes a game of billiards. As he moves around the billiard table, his lameness is distinctly noticeable. Not all the ingenuity of his tailor, nor his own efforts to walk naturally, can conceal it. Yet, as has been said of him in other matters, he redeems all his defects by his graces, and his companions note with surprise the remarkable change for the better which has taken place in him since, a few months before, he arrived at this old palace on the Arno with a troop of servants, carriages, horses, fowls, dogs, and monkeys. The selfish and sensual Byron of Venetian days is entirely a thing of the past. He is improved in every respect, says Shelley to Williams, in genius, in temper, in moral views, in health and happiness. And although keeping up a certain splendour upon an income of £4,000 a year, he devotes £1,000 of that income entirely to purposes of charity. His own personal needs are of the simplest. The game concluded, Byron's carriage is announced. His friends and he proceed in it as far as the town gates of Pisa, by this means to avoid the stares of the streets. Horses are in readiness at the gates. The company, with 1 or 2 servant men, mount and ride into the pine forest that reaches towards the sea. Byron is as excellent and graceful a rider as a swimmer, with remarkable powers of endurance. He can cover 70 or 80 miles a day, fast going, and swim 5 miles at a stretch. He is indeed in many respects the typical open-air Englishman. But today he rides slowly and immersed in thought. As his wife years since assured him, he is at heart the most melancholy of mankind, often when apparently the gayest. His abnormally long sight takes in every detail of the scenery, storing it up unconsciously for future reference. It has been said that Byron is nothing without his descriptions, and in these he has achieved some of his finest work, notably in some of the immortal stanzas of Childe Harold, with their dazzling panoramic succession of vivid scenes, whether depicting how I stood in Venice on the Bridge of Sighs, a palace and a prison on each hand. I saw from out the wave her structures rise, as from the stroke of the enchanter's wand. Or on the eve of Waterloo, there was a sound of revelry by night, and Belgium's capital had gathered then, her beauty and her chivalry, and bright the lamps shone o'er fair women and brave men. 1,000 hearts beat happily, and when music arose with its voluptuous swell, soft eyes looked love to eyes which spake again, and all went merry as a marriage bell. But hush, hark! A deep sound strikes like a rising knell. Whether again in the Vale of Vintage? The castled crag of Drachenfels frowns o'er the wide and winding Rhine, whose breast of waters broadly swells between the banks which bear the vine, and hills all riched with blossomed trees. And peasant girls with deep blue eyes, and hands which offer early flowers, walk smiling o'er this paradise, or looking backwards through a score of centuries. I see before me the gladiator lie. He leans upon his hand, his manly brow consents to death, but conquers agony, and his dropped head sinks gradually low, and through his side the last drops, ebbing slow, from the red gash fall heavy, one by one, like the first of a thunder shower, and now the arena swims around him, he is gone, ere ceased the inhuman shout which hailed the wretch who won. Byron is emphatically a citizen of the world, who has not only painted the environs, but reflected the passions and aspirations of every scene which he visualizes. And it is this magic power of conveying the authentic impression of an actual occurrence which renders his most recondite situations so thrilling, which breathes a western vigour into the scented air of the Orient, and thrills with poignant pathos through the horrors of the prisoner of Chillon.